The hospital board wanted my resignation letter on their desk by 5 p.m. Not because I made a mistake in that operating room, because Dr. Weller did, and he needed someone to blame before his malpractice insurance found out. I signed nothing. Instead, I asked for one thing: 48 hours. He smiled like he'd already won. He didn't know I'd spent the last 6 months quietly saving every email, every timestamp, every recorded consult he thought no one was listening to. By Monday morning, his name wouldn't be the only one trending. Mine would be too, but not the way he expected. My name is Mara Ellison. I was 26 years old, and I was about to learn that the most dangerous person in any hospital isn't the one who yells the loudest. It's the one who stays quiet, takes notes, and waits. 6 months earlier, none of this seemed possible. I was a physician assistant at Ashgrove Memorial, and Dr. Elliot Weller was the kind of surgeon hospitals build wings around. 30 years of experience. A wall of awards. A reputation so polished that nurses whispered his name like it belonged in a textbook. I respected him. That was my first mistake. He requested me personally for his surgical team after my 3rd month on staff, and I remember feeling something close to pride. Working under Dr. Weller meant something. It meant late nights reviewing charts, memorizing his preferences down to how he liked his instruments laid out, and absorbing every piece of advice he offered like it was gospel. For a while it was good. He taught me things no manual could. He'd catch small details before they became big problems: a slightly elevated heart rate, a chart that didn't quite add up. I thought I was learning from the best. I didn't yet understand that the best liars learn to hide their mistakes the same way they hide their brilliance, quietly and in plain sight. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday in March. A routine gallbladder procedure. Nothing that should have gone wrong. But halfway through, Dr. Weller's hand slipped, just slightly, just enough. I saw it. The attending anesthesiologist saw it. Nobody said anything because the patient survived, and surviving was supposed to be enough. Except 3 days later, that patient was back in the ICU with a complication that shouldn't have existed. Internal bleeding traced directly to the site of his error. I pulled the surgical log that night, the way I always did to prepare for morning rounds. And that's when I noticed something odd. The documented technique didn't match what I remembered seeing in that operating room. The notes described a clean, standard procedure. No mention of the slip. No mention of the extra 11 minutes it took him to stabilize what he disturbed. Someone had gone back and rewritten history. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Doctors were human. Maybe he'd corrected an error in the notes, not covered one up. I wanted to believe that because believing anything else meant admitting I worked for a man capable of erasing the truth to protect himself. I should have trusted my instincts. Instead, I trusted my boss. 2 weeks later, it happened again. A different patient, a different procedure, the same unsettling pattern, a small, avoidable mistake, followed by a chart that read like nothing had happened at all. This time, I wasn't imagining it. This time, I started paying closer attention to everything. I began keeping a private log of my own. Nothing dramatic, just times, dates, small inconsistencies between what I witnessed and what got typed into the system afterward. I told myself it was for my own peace of mind. I didn't yet know I was building a case. Then came the call that changed everything. It was a Thursday evening, and Dr. Weller asked me to stay late to review a patient file before an early surgery the next morning. When I arrived at his office, his tone was different. Softer. Almost fatherly, in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up before I understood why. Mara, he said, sliding a folder across his desk, I need you to initial this. I opened it. It was an amended procedure note from a surgery 2 days earlier, one where a medication dosage had been miscalculated during a critical moment. The kind of error that could have ended in a wrongful death lawsuit if the patient hadn't stabilized on his own. The note, as written, blamed the miscalculation on assistant oversight during medication administration. My signature. My name. My mistake, except it wasn't. I hadn't been anywhere near that medication cart. I'd been documenting vitals on the opposite side of the room, and he knew it. I didn't administer that dose, I said carefully. He didn't even blink. It's a formality. Paperwork. Nothing will come of it. But if something did, It's better this sits with you than with me. You understand how insurance works, Mara. One more incident on my record this year, and I lose surgical privileges. You're young. You have time to recover from something like this. I don't. There it was. Not an accusation. A transaction. He wasn't asking me to lie for him out of loyalty. He was asking me to absorb his failure because, in his mind, my future was simply worth less than his. I told him I needed time to think about it. He smiled the same calm, confident smile that had once made me feel safe in that operating room. Take the weekend, he said. But Mara, I'd hate for this to become complicated for you. It wasn't a threat. It was worse. It was a promise. I didn't sleep that weekend. I kept replaying every surgery, every quiet inconsistency I'd noticed over the past 6 months, every moment I'd chosen to trust him instead of my own eyes. And somewhere around 3 in the morning on Sunday, sitting alone in my apartment with his folder open on my kitchen table, something in me went very, very calm. Panic wasn't going to save me. Documentation would. I started that morning. Quietly. Methodically. I requested access to the full surgical archive under the pretense of preparing training materials for new residents, something I'd genuinely been asked to help with weeks earlier, which gave me a legitimate reason to be combing through old files without raising suspicion. What I found didn't just confirm my worst fear. It exposed something far bigger than one bad decision on one bad day. Dr. Weller had done this before. Not once. Not twice. At least 4 times over the previous 2 years, according to the discrepancies between original incident reports, the ones logged automatically by the hospital's digital timestamp system before edits were made, and the final, corrected, versions that made it into permanent patient records. Each time, a junior staff member's name appeared somewhere in the amended paperwork. Each time, that staff member had quietly left the hospital within a few months. I found the resignation letter of a nurse named Priya Kapoor, dated 14 months earlier. I found her through a mutual contact in the nursing union, and when I finally worked up the courage to call her, her voice cracked on the other end of the line before I'd even finished explaining why I was reaching out. He did it to me too, she said. I didn't have proof. I didn't have anything. I just left before it got worse. I did have proof. Or, at least, I was about to. Over the following weeks, I built what I can only describe as a case file. I saved the original time-stamped incident report before Dr. Weller had a chance to request edits. I photographed the folder he'd asked me to sign, keeping the original and signed copy as evidence that I'd never agreed to it. I reached out, carefully, anonymously at first, to 2 other former employees whose stories matched Priya's almost exactly. And I began recording our official meetings, which was completely legal in our state, as long as one party, me, consented. Dr. Weller had no idea the quiet assistant taking careful notes in every meeting was no longer just preparing for surgery. She was preparing for war. The following Monday, he called me back into his office, expecting an answer. I've thought about it, I told him, sliding the folder back across his desk, still unsigned. I'm not putting my name on something that isn't true. His expression shifted, just slightly, the first real crack I'd seen in his composure since I'd met him. Mara, I don't think you understand the position you're putting yourself in. I understand it perfectly, I said. I just don't think you understand the position you're already in. I didn't explain further. I didn't need to. I watched something flicker behind his eyes. Not fear yet, but the first uncomfortable itch of it. He'd spent 30 years assuming the people beneath him would always choose self-preservation over truth. He wasn't prepared for someone who'd already decided the two weren't mutually exclusive. That afternoon, I filed a formal complaint with the hospital's Ethics and Compliance Office, attaching the original unedited incident report and a written account of what I'd been asked to sign. I named Priya Kapoor as a corroborating witness, with her permission. I requested, carefully, in writing, that the hospital preserve all original digital records before any further edits could be made, citing the pattern I'd uncovered. Within 72 hours, the compliance office froze his editing privileges on the hospital's record system. Within a week, an internal investigation was officially opened, and Dr. Weller, for the first time in his career, was no longer the one asking the questions. He requested a meeting with me privately, off the record, in the hospital parking garage of all places, like something out of the movies I used to watch and never believed applied to real life. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not smaller in stature, smaller in certainty. "You're going to destroy your own career doing this," he said. "Nobody hires the assistant who took down her boss. You'll be radioactive." "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe I'll be the assistant who wouldn't lie for a man who let 4 other people take the fall for his mistakes before me." I turned and walked away before he could answer. For the first time in 6 months, I wasn't waiting to see what he'd do next. He was waiting to see what I'd do. The investigation took 11 weeks. 11 weeks of internal interviews, of quiet hallway glances from colleagues who'd heard rumors but didn't know the full story, of Dr. Weller's demeanor shifting from confident to controlled to visibly strained as more of the timeline came together. I kept working the entire time. I showed up to every shift, documented every patient interaction with obsessive precision, and refused to give anyone a reason to say I was anything other than exactly what I'd always been: thorough, careful, and honest. If he'd hoped I would crumble under the pressure, he'd badly misjudged who he was dealing with. The turning point came when the hospital's legal team, reviewing the case for liability exposure, discovered something Dr. Weller hadn't accounted for. The medication error from the folder he'd asked me to sign had already been flagged by the hospital's automated pharmacy system before he'd had a chance to alter the paperwork. The system logged his own override code at the exact time of the miscalculated dosage. There was no version of events where that mistake belonged to anyone but him. Confronted with a data trail even he couldn't rewrite, Dr. Weller did what people like him often do when the truth finally catches up. He tried to negotiate a quiet exit, a resignation with a clean reference before the state medical board got involved. The hospital said no. Once compliance realized the pattern extended to at least 4 prior incidents, involving 3 other former employees, quiet resignation was no longer on the table. This wasn't a mistake anymore. It was a system he'd built to protect himself at other people's expense, and hospitals, especially ones that valued their own reputation, don't cover for that once it's exposed internally, on the record with evidence. The state medical board opened a formal review. Priya Kapoor and the 2 other former employees I'd found came forward with their own accounts once they saw the investigation was real and that they wouldn't be facing it alone. What had started as one folder on one desk had become a pattern too large and too well documented to bury. Word moves fast in hospitals, faster than anyone in leadership ever wants it to. Within a month, local news picked up the story, not with my name attached, since I'd specifically requested to remain unnamed in any public reporting, but with enough detail about a pattern of falsified surgical records at a respected regional hospital that anyone inside Ashgrove Memorial knew exactly whose name belonged in that headline. Dr. Weller's surgical privileges were suspended pending the board's final decision. 3 months later, that suspension became permanent. He didn't lose his license through a single dramatic moment or a headline that named him directly. He lost it the way these things actually happen in real life. Slowly, methodically, buried under the weight of records he could no longer rewrite. I never gave an interview. I never wanted to be the face of what happened. I wanted, simply, to no longer be the person someone else's mistakes got pinned on. A year later, I still work at Ashgrove Memorial, though not as an assistant anymore. The compliance office, impressed by the thoroughness of my original complaint, offered me a position helping restructure how the hospital documents and reviews surgical incident reports, closing exactly the kind of loophole that had let one man rewrite the truth for years without consequence. Priya calls me sometimes just to check in. Last month she told me she'd finally stopped having the dream where she's back in that operating room, watching something happen she's not allowed to talk about. I understood exactly what she meant, because I used to have that dream too. I don't think about Dr. Weller often anymore. When I do, I don't feel triumphant, exactly. I feel something quieter than that, the kind of peace that comes from knowing I didn't have to shout to be believed. I didn't have to raise my voice, threaten anyone, or become someone I didn't recognize. I just had to keep telling the truth, one careful, documented moment at a time, until the truth became impossible to ignore. That's the part nobody tells you about standing up for yourself. It's rarely loud. It's rarely fast. Most of the time, It just looks like someone quietly refusing to sign their name to a lie and trusting that eventually the truth writes itself into the record whether the powerful want it to or not.